Hey everybody. So I thought we were going to finish Deuteronomy this morning, and it turned out chapter 33 was very demanding. So we have the very last chapter of Deuteronomy to do, and then I think we're going to have time to start Joshua together. So let's see, I'm going to put this over here. Begin with that poem, Come Divine Interpreter, and then we'll dive in. Come Divine Interpreter, bring me eyes thy book to read, ears the mystic words to hear, words which did from thee proceed, words that endless bliss impart, kept in my obedient heart. All who read or hear are blessed, if thy plain commands we do. Of thy kingdom here possessed, thee we shall in glory view. When thou comest on earth to abide, will reign triumphant at thy side. Okay, chapter 34 of Deuteronomy, the last chapter. And Moses went up from the plains of Moab, and unto the mountain of Nebo, to the top of Pisgah, that is over against Jericho. And the Lord showed him all the land of Gilead unto Dan, and all Naphtali, and the land of Ephraim and Manasseh, and all the land of Judah unto the utmost sea, and the south, and the plain of the valley of Jericho, the city of palm trees unto Zoar. And the Lord said unto him, This is the land which I swear unto Abraham, unto Isaac, and unto Jacob, saying, I will give it unto thy seed. I have caused thee to see it with thine eyes, that thou shalt not go over thither. So Moses, the servant of the Lord, died there in the land of Moab, according to the word of the Lord. And he buried him in a valley in the land of Moab, over against Beth Peor. But no man knoweth of his sepulchre unto this day. And Moses was 120 years old when he died. His eye was not dim, nor his natural force abated. And the children of Israel wept for Moses in the plains of Moab 30 days. So the days of weeping and mourning for Moses were ended. And Joshua the son of Nun was full of the spirit of wisdom, for Moses had laid his hands upon him. And the children of Israel hearkened unto him, and did as the Lord commanded Moses. And there arose not a prophet since in Israel like unto Moses, whom the Lord knew face to face. In all the signs and the wonders which the Lord sent him to do in the land of Egypt to Pharaoh, and to all his servants, and to all his land, and in all that mighty hand, and in all the great terror which Moses showed in the sight of all Israel. Thus ends the book of Deuteronomy. Okay. John Wesley divides it this way. Moses, having finished his testimony, finishes his life. This chapter was probably added by Samuel, who wrote by divine authority what he had found in the records of Joshua and his successors, the judges. Here is the view Moses had of the land in verses 1 through 4, his death, burial, and age in verses 5 through 7, Israel's mourning for him in verse 8, his successor in verse 9, his character in verses 10 through 12. In verse 1 it says, And Moses went up, quote, And Moses went up from the plains of Moab unto the mountain of Nebo, to the top of Pisgah, that is over against Jericho. When he knew the place of his death, he cheerfully mounted a steep hill to come to it. Those who are well acquainted with another world are not afraid to leave this. When God's servants are sent for out of the world, the summons runs, go up and die. When God's servants are sent for out of the world, the summons runs, go up and die. Exclamation mark. And the Lord showed him all the land of Gilead unto Dan. To that city which after Moses' death was called so. He says Daniel, but this is just Dan. So I don't know what to make of that. This comment that he made in verse 1 is about how people who know the Lord should feel about death. And he said something similar in the last chapter, which is when a person is in the Lord, they're not afraid of death. And in fact, they're somewhat eager to pass through that veil. And I had a great conversation with the congregation about being afraid of death. Even so, when one has a confidence that the Lord stands on the other side of death, then there's an eagerness. And I remember there being a believer in Shoshone, Idaho, when I was a preacher there, who said that she was eager to pass through the veil. And she died about a year ago. And I had a sense of peace about her passing that I haven't had about many. A great measure of one's faith is their feelings about their own death. And that's not to say that it's a light thing, that anyone just, oh yeah, sure, I would love to die. But in a very weighty, meaningful way, how ready are you to see an end to this life? And if you're not ready, if you're fearful, if you're reluctant to think about it, if your time comes and you're feeling crazy in your head, well, then now is the time to reckon with that. Now is the time to do something about that, because no one gets out of this world alive until Christ comes again. Which might be why some people pray for his second coming imminently, because they don't want to go through death. But I was reminded by a friend this morning. He heard my sermon on Sunday. I live streamed it. And he said, well, and I'm going to butcher the story, but there's a story of a doctor talking to a man who's about to die, and the man is upset and he's afraid. And then the doctor called out to his dog, who just happened to be visiting in the practice that day, and his dog came running into the room. And the doctor said, my dog had never been in this room before. Why do you think he just so eagerly ran into this room where he'd never been? He didn't know what would be on the other side of this curtain. And the man looked at his doctor, and the doctor said, it's because he heard my voice. He knew I was on the other side of this curtain, and he knew where I was. He wanted to be as well. He knew he'd be safe. He knew he'd be taken care of. And that anecdote's not in the Bible, but I think it is really helpful for us who know and love the Lord to remember that God has power over sin and death. And if we really believe that death holds no power over anyone who's in the Lord, then we shouldn't be so reluctant to die, to think about death, to prepare for death. And when it comes, we shouldn't be afraid to embrace death. In verse 2, it talks about all Naphtali, quote, and all Naphtali, and the land of Ephraim and Manasseh, and all the land of Judah, unto the utmost sea. The land of Naphtali, which together with Dan, was in the north of Canaan. I don't know why. I think it was the person who typed it up. Why would they? Daniel is just not it. All these regions were in the north of Canaan, as Ephraim and Manasseh were in the midland parts, and Judah on the south, and the sea on the west. So these parts lying in the several quarters are put for all the rest. He stood in the east and saw also Gilead, which was in the eastern part of the land, and thence he saw the north and south and west. And then when it talks about the utmost sea, that's the Midland Sea, which was the utmost bound of the land of promise on the west. In verse 3, it talks about the south, quote, and the south and the plain of the valley of Jericho, the city of palm trees unto Zoar. This is the south quarter of the land of Judah, which is towards the Salt Sea. The city of palm trees is Jericho, so called from the multitude of palm trees, which were in those parts, as Josephus and Strabo write. I don't know Strabo. From whence and the balm there growing it was called Jericho, which signifies odoriferous or sweet smelling. In verse 4, the phrase, I have caused thee to see it. Quote, and the Lord said unto him, this is the land which I swear unto Abraham, unto Isaac, and unto Jacob, saying, I will give it unto thy seed. I have caused thee to see it with thine eyes, but thou shalt not go over thither. J.W. says, for though his sight was good, yet he could not have seen all Canaan, 160 miles in length and 50 or 60 in breadth, if his sight had not been miraculously assisted and enlarged. He saw it at a distance, such a sight the Old Testament believers had of the kingdom of the Messiah. And such a sight believers have now of the glory that shall be revealed. Such a sight have we now of the knowledge of the glory of the Lord, which shall cover the earth. Those that come after us, shall undoubtedly enter into that promised land, which is a comfort to us when we find our own carcasses falling in this wilderness. So Moses gets to survey the promised land at the end of his life. He stands on top of this mountain and surveys the whole area. And then J.W. turns this into a sermon about how we believers also see with our spiritual sight the realm that's coming, the kingdom. And such a sight believers have now of the glory that shall be revealed. Such a sight have we now of the knowledge and glory of God, which shall cover the earth. Those that come after us shall undoubtedly enter into that promised land. So here's kind of like a modern progressivist notion of like, so there's one way of seeing history as static. You know, like God created things and we're perfect, and then we screwed it up and things have been crappy ever since. Jesus came to like show us the way, but history hasn't been saved yet. We haven't been restored to the perfection of original creation. JW seems to have this notion that we were bad. Jesus came, and now we're kind of progressing upwards to where God would have us. I think that's what he's saying is our children will be closer to the promised land than we are. And I'm not sure theologically I agree with that. However, what I would agree with is saying that God has given us spiritual sight to see the promise of his kingdom. We will see it realized partly here in this life through the power of the Holy Spirit and in the presence of the church as we meditate upon his word and have holy fellowship. And that one day when Christ returns, we'll see the fullness of his glory. But I don't believe that one generation is any closer to that than any other generation. You can have your own opinion because this is America. In verse, I meant to highlight that, excuse me, 1 second. All right, so verse 5, the phrase, so Moses, the servant of the Lord, died. You remember that? He is called the servant of the Lord, not only as a good man, all such are his servants, but as a man eminently useful, who had served God's counsels in bringing Israel out of Egypt and leading them through the wilderness. And it was more his honor to be the servant of the Lord than to be king in Jeshurun. We talked about that in the last chapter. Yet he dies. Neither his piety nor his usefulness would exempt him from the stroke of death. God's servants must die, that they may rest from their labors, receive their recompense, and to make room for others. But when they go hence, they go to serve him better, to serve him day and night in his temple. The Jews say God sucked his soul out of his body with a kiss. No doubt he died in the embraces of his love. That's interesting. You know, I never heard that legend that God sucked his soul out of his body with a kiss. That's quite a thing. There's a lot we can say here. God's servants must die that they may rest from their labors, receive their recompense, and make room for others. So the notion here, and it's pretty common nowadays, John Wesley preaches against this in other places, but the notion is that from the moment, right when we die, doesn't matter if we're a martyr or not, we ascend into heaven and we're in the presence of God, rewarded for our labors. And you know, there is a text where Paul talks in such terms as that, and the question is that for just martyrs, or is that for all believers? Because in Revelation it seems to indicate that it's just for martyrs. There's also an interesting legend about Jesus ascending onto a mountain and being transfigured before his disciples. And he has a conversation with Elijah and Moses. And Elijah, we know, was taken up into heaven without dying. Moses, it's not clear. It seems like Moses, it's the same as Elijah. So there seems to be a question about if Moses did ever actually die, or if perhaps God actually took him up into heaven without letting him die as well. Otherwise, the story seems somewhat incoherent. Now, God can do anything he pleases, but even so, it's worth asking that question. Maybe it's not. Maybe I've just wasted everybody's time. Anyway, if the main question is, was it okay for Moses to die? Is it okay for believers to die? Well, yeah. Yeah, and we've already talked about that. Verse 6, there's a question of who he is. Quote, and he buried him in a valley in the land of Moab. Who buried Moses? The Lord buried him either immediately or by the ministry of angels, whereof Michael was the chief or prince. When it says we do not know of where his sepulchre is, it means of the particular place where he was buried, which God hid from the Israelites to prevent their superstition and idolatry, to which he knew their great proneness. So if they'd known where he was buried, they might return there to worship him rather than the Lord. And for this very reason, the devil endeavored to have it known and contended with Michael about it, and that's in Jude, verse 9. God takes care even of the dead bodies of his servants. As their death is precious, so is their dust. Not one grain of it shall be lost, but the covenant with it shall be remembered. So he turns this into a sermon as well. We need not be concerned with the dead bodies of those who died in the Lord. God, I'm inferring a couple things here, but there are people who've insisted that Christian bodies need to be protected, that if they're mangled, their salvation might be at stake, but there can be a confident Christian witness that no matter what happens to it, a dead body, God will reconstitute it on the last day. That there is such a thing as a bodily resurrection, and God is not going to be limited to the bodies that weren't burned or eaten by worms. I mean, all bodies fall apart on a molecular level. God is still going to reconstitute those bodies in the resurrection. In verse 7, when it says Moses' eye was not dim, J.W. says, by a miraculous work of God in mercy to his church and people. So there's this prevailing notion that the Lord, even though things age, the Lord keeps them from showing that age. So like, for instance, when the people were in the wilderness for 40 years, their clothes didn't fall apart. Their shoes didn't fall apart. That's a miracle right there. Likewise, most people, when they get older, their eyesight starts to fail. Modern day surgery does a lot to prevent that for many people, but here JW just points to the fact that God, I mean, this is a more ordinary sort of means of miracle here. In verse 8, it talks about a miracle, quote, and the children of Israel wept for Moses in the plains of Moab 30 days. Why did I say miracle? Oh, because I was just talking. 30 days is what we're picking on here, which was the usual time of mourning for persons of high place and eminency. 'Tis a debt owing to the surviving honor of deceased worthies to follow them with our tears, as those who loved and valued them are sensible of the loss and humbled for the sins which have provoked God to deprive us of them. So here's something that really is culturally foreign to us now. English-speaking peoples used to mourn our dead. We used to have formalized processes whereby the relatives of a loved one would wear black. They would be in an official period of mourning, which would be honored by culture at large. Now we've got a culture that's very afraid of death. And so we've ended this. We see it as morose or like depressing to be in a time of mourning. And it's very rare for anyone. I've never known anyone who wore black or veiled their face or spent any time fasting but back in these days, I mean, for the majority of human history, that's been a norm. I can't speak for all cultures, but at least in biblical cultures, a time of mourning our dearly departed, it's normal and natural. It's not saying that we're defeated or they're defeated. It's just we're separated for right now, and that makes us sad. So this is one of those things that I think the fact that we've lost it is unfortunate, But I've done a lot of funerals as a pastor, and I've seen a lot of families be very reluctant to acknowledge sadness or mourning. I've heard a lot of families be very concerned. We want this to be a celebration of life. We don't want any mourning or crying or sadness. And I think that's really unfortunate, because that makes invalid a very natural human experience, which is blessed by the Lord in His holy word. It's okay that we mourn the loss of loved ones. It's okay that we're sad. Heck, if I died tomorrow, I would want my wife and kids to be sad. I want them to miss me. I want them to be okay, but I want them to have a time of mourning where they're just intentionally in grief because of my loss. There's nothing wrong with that. In verse 9, it talks about wisdom. Quote, "And Joshua the son of Nun was full of the spirit of wisdom." JW says, "And other gifts and graces too, but wisdom is mentioned as being most necessary for the government to which he was now called." And then it says, he was filled with that spirit because Moses had laid his hands upon him. And this was the thing which Moses at that time asked of God for him. God asked his wisdom for Joshua. In verse 10, there's a phrase, "whom the Lord," quote, "and there arose not a prophet since in Israel like unto Moses, whom the Lord knew face to face." Whom God did so freely and familiarly converse with. So this is something that JW's talked about before. What's it mean when the Lord spoke with Moses face to face? Is this literal? Is this familiar? Moses came down on the side with just familiar, metaphorical, not literal. However, it's always seemed interesting to me that when they get done speaking face to face, Moses' face itself glows, and he has to veil his face so that people don't get hurt looking at him. If it's just metaphorical, then why would his face glow? I haven't heard a good answer to that question. Verse 12, Moses was greater than any other of the prophets of the Old Testament. By Moses, God gave the law and molded and formed the Jewish church. By the other prophets, he only sent particular reproofs, directions, and predictions. But as far as the other prophets came short of him, our Lord Jesus went beyond him. Moses was faithful as a servant, but Christ is the Son. His miracles were more illustrious. His communion with the Father was more intimate, for he is in his bosom from eternity. Moses lies buried, but Christ is sitting at the right hand of God, and of the increase of his government there shall be no end. That's a quote from Isaiah. It's a prophetic prophecy about Christ. Yeah, that's a great end to the book of Deuteronomy. There are probably a lot of other intelligent and conscientious things to be said, but that's not the purpose of this particular segment. So we'll call an end to our time in Deuteronomy. I think it's been a wonderful thing to do, and I'm just going to keep on going through Joshua. So why don't we just have a moment of transition. Okay. Our minds can now be drawn to Joshua. And what I want to urge everybody to do, I didn't do this at the beginning of Deuteronomy, but there's an amazing ministry going on today called the Bible Project. These guys are active on YouTube. They also have a Facebook channel. They also have a podcast, which I listen to, and that's really helped me a lot as a pastor. But on YouTube, they have several videos. They have theme videos that I think are quite impressive, but they also have a book for every book of the Bible. They show you how it's laid out. They talk about the primary theological concerns, the takeaways that we should have. After I do this video, I'm going to go watch theirs on Joshua. I wanted to make it a priority this morning, and then I just didn't have time. But they will give a good outline for you to understand the layout of the book. Just go to YouTube and then type in The Bible Project Joshua. If you type that, that should be the first video that comes up. Click that. Usually their videos are no longer than 10 minutes. Most of them are around 6 or 5. So that'll just help you have an appreciation for the book. And then when we get to the tail end of it, watch the video again. And that just really helps you set it in your mind what this book is about, how it's laid out. JW also, at the start of every book in his commentary, does his own setup for it. So that's what I want to do now, is read through his setup for the book of Joshua. And then if there's time, we can read through the first chapter. In this book, and those that follow to the end of Esther, we have the history of the Jewish nation. So Joshua, Judges, Ruth, 1st and 2nd Samuel, 1st and 2nd Kings, 1st and 2nd Chronicle, Ezra, Nehemiah, Esther. So that's 12 books. We have the history of the Jewish nation. So a lot of history up ahead. These books, to the end of the 2nd book of Kings, the Jewish writers call the 1st book of the prophets, as being written by prophets, men divinely inspired. Indeed, it is probable they were collections of the authentic records of the nation, which some of the prophets were divinely directed and assisted to put together. It seems the substance of the several histories was written under divine direction when the events had just happened, and long after put into the form wherein they stand now, perhaps all by the same hand. In the 5 books of Moses, we had a full account of the rise and constitution of the Old Testament church, the miracles by which it was built up, and the laws and ordinances by which it was to be governed. And any nation that had statutes and judgments so righteous, one would think, should have been very holy. But alas, a great part of the history is a representation of their sins and miseries. For the law made nothing perfect. That was to be done by the bringing in of the better hope. He's talking about Jesus. The book of Joshua, if not written by him, was at least collected out of his journals or memoirs. It contains the history of Israel under the command of Joshua, how he presided over them, in their entrance into Canaan in chapters 1 through 5, in their conquest of Canaan, chapters 6 through 12, in the distribution of the land among the tribes of Israel in chapters... It wasn't... in chapters 13 through 21. In the establishment of religion among them, chapters 21 through 24, in all which he was a great example of wisdom, courage, fidelity, and piety. And in this history we may see 2 things. 1, much of God and his providence, his power in the kingdom of nature, his justice in punishing the Canaanites, his faithfulness to his covenant with the patriarchs, his kindness to his people. And 2, the first is God and his providence. The second thing we're going to see is much of Christ and his grace, Joshua being in many respects an eminent type of him. So here what JW is saying is Moses was a type of Jesus. He was a great forerunner of the faith, like a forerunner of who Jesus would be. And then likewise Joshua, in a different way, similar in a different way. Jesus is the ultimate fulfillment of what a prophet is, what a priest is, what a king is, what a warrior is. These are all the things. Jesus fulfills all these things. So, let's see. I kind of don't think... No, I'm not going to be a wimp. Let's do chapter 1. Listen to the word of God. Now after the death of Moses, the servant of the Lord, it came to pass that the Lord spake unto Joshua, the son of Nun, Moses' minister, saying, Moses, my servant, is dead. Now therefore arise, go over this Jordan, thou and all this people, unto the land which I do give to them, even to the children of Israel. Every place that the sole of your foot shall tread upon, that have I given unto you, as I said unto Moses. From the wilderness and this Lebanon, even unto the great river, the river Euphrates, all the land of the Hittites, and unto the great sea toward the going down of the sun, shall be your coast. There shall not any man be able to stand before thee all the days of thy life. As I was with Moses, so I will be with thee. I will not fail thee nor forsake thee. Be strong and of a good courage, for unto this people shalt thou divide for an inheritance the land which I swear unto their fathers to give them. Only be thou strong and very courageous, that thou mayest observe to do according to all the law which Moses my servant commanded thee. Turn not from it to the right hand or to the left, that thou mayest prosper whithersoever thou goest. This book of the law shall not depart out of thy mouth, but thou shalt meditate therein day and night, that thou mayest observe to do according to all that is written therein. For then thou shalt make thy way prosperous, and then thou shalt have good success. Have not I commanded thee? Be strong and of good courage. Be not afraid, neither be thou dismayed, for the Lord thy God is with thee whithersoever thou goest. Then Joshua commanded the officers of the people, saying, Pass through the host, and command the people, saying, Prepare you victuals, for within 3 days ye shall pass over this Jordan, to go in to possess the land which the Lord your God giveth you to possess it. And to the Reubenites, and to the Gadites, and to the half-tribe of Manasseh spake Joshua, saying, Remember the word which Moses the servant of the Lord commanded you, saying, The Lord your God hath given you rest, and hath given you this land. Your wives, your little ones, and your cattle shall remain in the land which Moses gave you on this side Jordan, but ye shall pass before your brethren armed, all the mighty men of valor, and help them, until the Lord hath given your brethren rest, as he hath given you, and they also have possessed the land which the Lord your God giveth them. Then ye shall return unto the land of your possession, and enjoy it, which Moses the Lord's servant gave you on this side Jordan towards the sunrising. And they answered Joshua, saying, All that thou commandest us we will do, and whithersoever thou sendest us we will go. According as we hearkened unto Moses in all things, so will we hearken unto thee. Only the Lord thy God be with thee, as he was with Moses. Whosoever he be that doth rebel against thy commandment, and will not hearken unto thy words and all that thou commandest him, he shall be put to death. Only be strong and be of good courage. The word of the Lord. Okay, so after the death of Moses, talked about in verse 1, either immediately after it or when the days of mourning for Moses were expired, Joshua was appointed and declared Moses' successor in the government before this time, and here he receives confirmation from God therein. When it calls Moses the servant of the Lord, this title is given to Moses here and in verse 2, also in Deuteronomy in the last chapter, and is repeated not without cause to reflect honor upon him, to give authority to his laws and writings, in publishing whereof he acted as God's servant in his name. So we don't think of servant necessarily in a flattering way, but here it's being very clear. Moses, as a servant of God, had a very intimate and close place at God's side. So it's not a, today it would almost, when you're a servant, it's an insult almost. Here it's a compliment. And that the Israelites might not think of Moses above what was meet, remembering that, so it's a compliment, but it's not too high a compliment. So they were to remember that he was not the Lord himself, but only the Lord's servant, and therefore not to be too pertinaciously followed in all his institutions when the Lord himself should come and abolish part of the Mosaic dispensation. Ooh, that's quite a thing to say. So John Wesley was apparently a dispensationalist, thinking that the original law given by Moses, there was some need of it to be canceled out for the new law of Christ. I hope I remember that. I'm just going to go ahead and highlight that. It being but reasonable that he who was only a servant in God's house should give place to him who was the Son, that's Jesus, and heir and Lord of it. In verse 1 it says, the Lord spake unto Joshua, son of Nun, is what it says. So either in a dream or vision, or by Urim and Thummim, we were talking about, that's the holy lots cast by the high priest. Moses' minister, describes Joshua as Moses' minister. This means he had waited upon Moses in his great employments and thereby been privy to his manner of government and so prepared for it. So, a minister in this context, we in America, we don't have legal ministers, but a minister is someone who runs an administration. It's the same etymology. And so in say Great Britain, you have like a minister of finance or a prime minister. You have, I can't talk too much about it because I don't know that much about it, but minister deals primarily with administration. And so here, when it says he was a minister, Moses' minister, it means that he helped Moses in the administration of the Israelites. Verse 2, the phrase, now therefore arise, Moses my servant is dead, says God to Joshua. Now therefore arise, go over this Jordan. JW says, let not the withering of the most useful hands be the weakening of ours. When God has work to do, he will either find or make instruments fit to carry it on. Moses the servant is dead, but God the master is not. He lives forever. When it says to cross this Jordan, JW says, which is now near thee, which is the only obstacle in thy way to Canaan. He says, unto the land which I do give them, even unto the children of Israel. That is the land which I am now about to give thee actual possession of it, as I formerly gave a right to it by promise. So they've had the rights to this land for centuries. However, they haven't claimed it yet. So they're going in to claim their birthright through the Lord. This original theological point, let not the withering of the most useful hands be the weakening of ours. So you'll find this within churches in particular. You'll have a generation that went before that really did excellent work and were admirable people. And when that generation starts dying off, then the later generations have a decision to make. Are we going to be discouraged by this? Are we going to be set back by this? Or are we going to step up to take on their mantle? And here the answer is very clear. But a lot of churches just fizzle out because they're so sad at the loss and they're so discouraged and they're not sure that they want to take the helm. When you serve the Lord, there's not an option. You serve. In verse 3, there's a question of what the phrase every place means. Quote, every place that the sole of your foot shall tread upon, that have I given unto you. And JW just makes it clear that is within the following bounds. So right after this, it says, within these areas, that's where I want you to go. So it's not as though they could have marched over to India and claimed all that land because of this one phrase. This phrase is conditioned. In verse 4, it talks about Lebanon, quote, from the wilderness of this Lebanon, even unto the great river. JW says, emphatically as being the most eminent mountain in Syria and the northern border of the land, or this, this would be like the Golan Heights, I think. That's a modern day area. Or this which is within thy view. When it talks about the Hittites, quote, the river Euphrates, all the way to the land of the Hittites and unto the great sea. Hittites of the Canaanites, who elsewhere are called Amorites. For example, in Genesis 15, verse 16. And here Hittites, the Hittites being the most considerable and formidable of all the Canaanites. When it talks about the greater, quote, and unto the great sea toward the going down of the sun shall be your coast. The Midland Sea, great in itself, and especially compared with those lesser collections of waters, which the Jews called seas. Quote, but the Israelites never possessed all this land. Oh, he anticipates people reading this and saying, but the Israelites never possessed all this land, which is true. JW responds two things. that was from their own sloth and cowardice and disobedience to God and breach of those conditions upon which this promise was suspended. And 2, though their possessions extended not to Euphrates, yet their dominion did. And all those lands were tributary to them in David's and Solomon's time. I'm sure we will come back to those 2 arguments. In verse 5, there's a phrase, with Moses, quote, there shall not any man be able to stand before thee all the days of thy life. As I was with Moses, so I will be with thee. The Lord is speaking to Joshua still. To assist him against all his enemies and in all the difficulties of governing this stiff-necked people, which Joshua might justly fear no less than the Canaanites, God says he will not forsake thee, which means I will not leave thee destitute either of inward support or of outward assistance. In verse 6, the Lord exhorts him, be strong and of good courage. Joshua, though a person of great courage and resolution, whereof he had given sufficient proof, yet needs these encouragements, exhortations, partly because his work was great and difficult and long, and in a great measure new, partly because he had a very mean opinion of himself, especially if compared with Moses, and remembering how perverse and ungovernable that people were, even under Moses, he might very well suspect the burden of ruling them would be too heavy for his shoulders. So it's trying to explain why God would even to tell him this if he's been serving under Moses for several years, and the 2 answers were because the work is very difficult, and he knew he wasn't Moses, and he didn't know if he was up to the work. In verse 7, there's the phrase, commanded thee, quote, only be thou strong and very courageous, that thou mayest observe to do according to all the law which Moses my servant commanded thee. Remember, says John Wesley, that though thou art the commander of my people, yet thou art my subject, and obliged to observe all my commands. When it says you should not turn to the right hand or to the left, turn not from it to the right hand or to the left, that thou mayest prosper whithersoever thou goest. That is, don't turn in any kind or upon any pretense. This plainly shows that God's assistance promised to him and the Israelites was conditional and might justly be withdrawn upon their breach of conditions. So this is not an unconditional covenant he's making with them. It's conditional upon them continuing to abide by his law. If obedience leaves, then so does God's faithfulness to them. When it says that he will bless them wherever they go, let's see, that was verse 7, that thou mayest prosper whithersoever thou goest. That is, whatsoever thou doest. Men's actions are often compared to ways or steps by which they come to the end they aim at. I'm sure that was profound in its original context. In verse 8, there's the phrase, out of thy mouth. Quote, this book of the law shall not depart out of thy mouth. That is, thou shalt constantly read it, and upon occasion discourse of it, and the sentence shall come out of thy mouth, shall in all things be given according to this rule. God says, but thou shalt meditate therein day and night. J.W. says, that is, diligently study the word, and upon all occasions consider what is God's will and thy duty. The greatness of thy place and employments shall not hinder thee from this work, because this is the only rule of all thy private actions and public administrations. So this is a correction to us today who we have busy lives, and we say, oh, I can't read the Bible. I've got kids, I got a job, I got sports, I got, whatever. Here it's saying Joshua was a ruler of a migrant nation whose job was to invade a territory, take over the land, not fall apart, not turn on each other, abide by God's law, walk in his ways all the time. That's a very high order. However, it all depends on him being faithful in covenant with the Lord, knowing his word, meditating upon it day and night. That's the condition. The condition hasn't changed for God's people. There's still an expectation that God's people meditate upon his word day and night. And if we don't, if it's not flowing out of our mouths, if it's not our love language, then we're not taking the word as seriously as it deserves, and that What if God's covenant with us is likewise conditional? What if his grace is not to be poured out upon us unless we're walking faithfully with him? Do we really have a right to expect God's blessings on us if we don't have it in us to know his word, to speak his word, to abide by his word, to be guided in our lives by his word? That's what it was written to do. In verse 9, there's the phrase, I commanded thee, quote, have not I commanded thee? Be strong and of a good courage. Be not afraid, neither be thou dismayed. J.W. says, I whom thou art obliged to obey, I who can carry thee through everything I put upon thee, I of whose faithfulness and mighty power thou hast had large experience. So he just thought that God could have bragged about himself a little bit more there. In verse 10, the officers of the people are mentioned. Then Joshua commanded the officers of the people. These who commanded under Joshua in their respective tribes and families attended him for orders, which they were to transmit to the people. So this is a very similar setup to when Moses was in charge. In verse 11, it says, prepare you victuals. Victuals is spelled V-I-C-T-U-A-L-S, and that's usually food. Prepare food for a journey. Verse 11, pass through the host and command the people, saying, prepare you victuals, for within 3 days ye shall pass over this Jordan to go and to possess the land. So victuals is just supplies you need for travel. J.W. says, for although manna was given them to supply their want of ordinary provisions in the wilderness, yet they were allowed, when they had opportunity, to purchase other provisions, and did so, for instance, in Deuteronomy chapter 2, verses 6 and 28, and now having been some time in the land of Amorites, and together with manna, used themselves to other food, which that country plentifully supplied them with. They are warned to furnish themselves therewith for their approaching march. When it says that they do it in 3 days, these words, though placed here, seem not to have been delivered by Joshua till after the return of the spies, which transpositions being frequent in Scripture. And hence it comes that these 3 days mentioned here below after the history of the spies are again repeated in chapter 3, verse 2. So here his concern is making sure that the timeline adds up right. In verse 13, there's a phrase, commanded you, quote, remember the word which Moses the servant of the Lord commanded you, saying, the Lord your God hath given you rest and hath given you this land. J.W. says, his charge to you and your promise to him. When it says he's given you rest, that is a place of rest, as the word signifies. So they're not going to go into the land and immediately rest. They're going to fight. But that land is a land of rest, which eventually they'll be able to rest in. In verse 14, there's a phrase, before their brethren, quote, your wives, your little ones, and your cattle shall remain in the land which Moses gave you on this side Jordan, but ye shall pass before your brethren armed, all the mighty men of valor, and help them. J.W. explains, in the front of all them, which was but reasonable. Okay, so the setup here is Gad, let's see, who are these? The Reubenites, the Gadites, and the half-tribe of Manasseh. All of them have been given land now on the eastern side of the Jordan River. They've already been given their land. If they were selfish, they would just stay there and say, we got our land, we don't need to go in with you guys and risk losing any of our men. We're just going to camp out here. Here, Joshua holds them to their word, which they swore to Moses, that when the time came, they would invade with. The new thing here, I don't think the language was said before, that they would be at the front of the battle line, that they would put themselves in greater risk than the other men of the other tribes. So J.W. says this was but reasonable because they had the advantage of their brethren, having actually received their portion, which their brethren had only in hope, because they were freed from those impediments which the rest were exposed to, namely their wives, their children, and estates being safely lodged, and to prevent their withdrawing themselves from the present service, which they otherwise would have been tempted to do because of the nearness of their habitations. Verse 14, ye shall pass before your brethren armed. When it's talking about armed, for by this time they were well furnished for arms, which they had either from the Egyptians, Amalekites, or Amorites, from whom they had taken them, or by purchase from those people by whose borders they had passed over. All the mighty men of valor, and help them. Who are the mighty men of valor? All such were obliged to go over if occasion required it, but Joshua took only some of them, because they were sufficient for his purpose, and because some were fit to be left, both to secure their own wives, children, and possessions, and to prevent their enemies on that side from giving them disturbance in their enterprise upon Canaan. So the notion here is that not every single person with male genitals went over the Jordan. There were some males who remained behind to protect the land that they had just inherited. But the mighty men of valor were to go over with the rest of the tribes. In verse 16, there's the phrase, and they answered, quote, and they answered Joshua, saying, all that thou commandest us, we will do. So JW says, not the 2 tribes and in half only. So before he was only talking to 2.5 tribes. Now this is all 12 tribes. So not just these 2.5, but the officers of all the people in their name, concurring with the divine appointment by which Joshua was set over them. Thus we must swear allegiance to our Lord Jesus as the captain of our salvation. Okay. Final verse, and then we'll be done for the day. Is verse 17, the phrase, unto thee. Quote, according as we hearkened unto Moses in all things, so we will hearken unto thee. JW says, the same obedience which we owed to Moses, we promise unto thee. Yep, that's self-evident. When it says with Moses, this is not a limitation of their obedience. So they're not saying we only followed Moses a little bit and that's how much we'll follow you. As if they would not obey him any longer than he was prosperous, but it's an additional prayer for him. What was that prayer? So we will hearken unto thee, only the Lord thy God be with thee as he was with Moses. Okay, so that's a prayer of blessing. As we have hereby promised thee our obedience, so our prayer shall be that God would bless and prosper thee as he did Moses. Okay, well, we've reached the end of chapter 1 in Joshua. Joshua is going to be a bit more logistics, movement from town to town, a lot more war, and then it's just going to be more history. So your time would not be wasted if you looked up some maps. On Google, if you go to images.google.com, you can just type in maps 12 tribes or maps Israelite invasion. Just mess with different phrases and you'll find different maps, and some of them are higher quality than others. But really, I found it helpful to look at different maps of different qualities because they don't draw all the borders the exact same way. They don't note all the exact same cities and landmarks. So this is one of those things where you learn more the more you mess around. But maps are really helpful here. And then, like I said at the beginning, go ahead and watch the Bible Project video on Joshua. And go ahead and watch the one on Deuteronomy if you like, to help it wrap it up in a little bow. But I pray that God is continuing to be with us as we seek him out in his word. As Lent continues on, I'm going to continue to do this hopefully 3 times a day. And then when Lent ends, I intend to keep on going probably once or twice a day for probably an hour and a half to mark more out. But this has been something that's really helped me as a pastor, but it would really be helpful to pretty much any believer who wants to figure out the word a bit more. So I know that several of you have dipped in and out and found it to be a blessing. So I hope that we continue to keep this good thing going. So God bless all of you this day. Be safe, but more importantly, be faithful. Bye.